Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Rather wonderful opportunity to share the work of Randy Johnston along with his good friend and compatriot, Gustin, to have an opportunity to take time out to look at pots, talk about them, and try to share as best we can the work itself, knowing full well that if you really want to share them, you need to come to the gallery or pick up a pot and hold it. One of the ongoing joys for us of the gallery has been so many and a growing number of ceramics programs in the Boston area in any event, where people come in and they're just delighted to be able to hold the pieces, as contrasted with when they go to a museum and a guard yells at them, "Don't get near that pot." So the whole notion that this is the work of someone's hands that can be held and then shared in that way has made the experience of having Randy's work and, in fact, the other 3,000 pots in the gallery an absolute joy and delight for all of us. Today, we're going to talk a bit about the maker of memory and Randy's work. I would begin with a favorite quote of mine from Brother Thomas, which is, "What is old is beautiful is always new, and what is beautiful and new is always old." The notion that for us as human beings to both reach into the past, to enrich the present, and at the same time to be aware that we exist in the present toward a future. So the continuity of time, as represented by the work of Randy Johnston in this case, who is, in our view, a maker of memory, provides us with an opportunity to have, I hope, a conversation that will be both interesting, rewarding, and provocative. So, Carolyn, let's look at the title first. It gives you a certain sense of not only the title, but one of the more extraordinary pieces in the full collection, which we'll be able to talk about later in the conversation. But just to keep that title in mind, we do try with each exhibition to invite a scholar or knowledgeable individual in the area of the show itself and the art itself to share their comments and ideas around the work. And this catalog is no different. It is available online if you want it, or we're certainly happy to mail you a copy of the catalog to be able to engage the work that way as well. So let's begin with the first piece if we can. Square vase form with nuka glaze and iron slip finger marks. Randy, can you talk a bit about how you have come to this form, which was slightly smaller in the last show, was done with the Shino glaze, and now in the nuka glaze with the wonderful finger marks and the undertone that you've included with this one?
Yeah, but first, Bernie, I back up a little bit. I want to thank you and Sue, for running and maintaining the gallery since 1967. What an honor to be represented by you, and I do encourage anybody visiting Boston or in Boston certainly to come into the gallery. It's people email me all the time and say, "I can't believe how wonderful the staff was and gracious to me, and I actually got to hold some Hamada pots or some tin Matsuzaki pots or see some of the wonderful paintings that are evident in the gallery." So thank you very much. And behind every great man is a greater woman, Susan.
Right. No question about that. Thank you for acknowledging Sue, and I'm happy to be the front man.
The square bottle is, in some ways it's an archetypal form, but this is it's a vase form. It's squared off, it's carved, it's added to. It brings it to play many of the ideas and things that I try to incorporate into my work. Working in art or working in clay is about bringing a human experience or my experience and visual vocabulary to any given piece. And I think this surface, again, it starts off as hand-built, made from slabs. So I start with an idea or sometimes even a sketch for proportions and scale and size, and then lay out the slab pieces, begin to texturize it. One of the things that I again find very important in the work, and I think I can credit this back to Hamada, is the idea of layering of information. And there might be 5 or 6 different layers of built-up information on this piece, and in the hopes that it gives some depth and carries some of that visual memory and visual experience that I have put into this piece during the making process. Nuka glaze. Nuka is made from 3 simple ingredients: rice hull ash, wood ash, and feldspar. It's a very irascible glaze, misbehaves. It's like just a powder on the surface. Very, very, very kind of different results from different kinds of firings and the different ashes that are involved in the making of the glaze. The finger marks are part of my honoring the memory of a visit to a cave in France, the cave of Font-de-Gaume, where I witnessed the finger marks of 25 people from about 15,000 years ago that had been spray painted on the back walls of the cave.
So Chris, as a practitioner of making objects in clay and wonderful things, how do you respond to this piece and some of the things that Randy has just said?
Well, this is one of my favorite pieces in the show, in the work that I've seen, and it is so much about the title of the exhibition. It is a very seemingly simple form, but it is just so full of information that just keeps pulling you in, and it's very quiet, but there's a sense of process in this that has to do with time. And Randy talked about the number of layers that went into the making of this. You have the clay, you have the surface on the clay, you have the marking, you have the glaze, you have process, you have fire, you have all these things that are kind of overlapped with each other. But this is also an incredibly complex object. There's so much here. And I just really love how Randy deals with kind of geometry, the formal aspects of form, and he does it in a way that is very quiet and simple, but it holds everything together. The construct of memory. When we come to an object and we look at it, we're always trying to find reference. Okay, and you're trying to find, Bernie, you talked about the construct of beauty. And beauty is it is based in memory. It is based in when you see something, you recall, and you're like enlightened, and you're flashed upon in a moment of clarity of something that just fills you with joy, with quietness, with energy. So I look at this pot, and those finger marks to me are just incredible, because Randy talks about the touch of these cave dwellers on the wall and the memory of that. But I also see this as like, stones in the water at the edge of a beach. The froth of the water is flowing over the sand, and it passes around and eddies around these stones, and it leaves a trail. Because it's a vertical form, it's something sliding down a wall, a water moving down the wall. There's so many analogies one can bring to this object through their own personal narratives, their own personal histories. And I think that's the power of this kind of work. And I think in this piece, it's really brought forward.
Love what you're saying, and it reminds me much that, if I'm not correct or wrong either, Randy, didn't Hamada talk to you about the underglaze in this particular piece, which you had not used for a long time and then suddenly began reintroducing that, so that there's an internal warmth almost visually to the piece itself, that underglaze glows through, enables the finger marks to show up in such a beautiful way, and to invite people to a place that they may never have been to before, but they come to it with who they are and what makes them unique, and you call that out for them, enable them to access that. Sorry, you go ahead.
Well, yeah, you touched on two, I think, really important things, Bernie, and Chris, thank you for all those comments. It's very humbling. Two things that happen, I think, in any successful piece of art, whether it's a pot like this one or a painting or a sculpture, is that it enters in and continues a collaboration with the viewer, and that can be in current time. We were talking about the Talmud dating back to the 1st century BC, and why those thoughts, why those ideas continue to be pervasive in our current culture are, I think, what is so important about art in all of our lives, is that it brings us to a conversation, a continuing collaboration and conversation with that piece. Technically, Bernie, you asked about the underglaze. The underglaze is a slip, and in Mashiko we use a slip it's called Odo. It was just an ochre, impure ochre slip. And what it does under the Nuka glaze is it has some iron and maybe manganese impurities in it. And in interaction with the ash, this gets technical, but in interaction with heat and the composition of that glaze, it produces this bluish cast to the piece. They call it Nezumi. They'll say Nezumi Shino. I remember Ken laughing at me when I was saying Nezumi no Shino. If anybody's speaking Japanese out there, what I was saying was it's the mouse's Shino.
Right.
But dating back to the Monumental period, probably because they had a light background clay, they put an iron slip on it, and it began to create this contrast, or this pass through the glass of this beautiful layered color. And it's just, it's casting another moment into the piece that people that are receptive to it will pick up on and hopefully carry them forward with the piece for a long time.
Lovely. I want to move on to the next piece, because it is a form that is obviously used in Japan and has been for about 4 centuries, the tea bowl, but also to ask Randy particularly to talk about your tea bowls as contrasted with those tea bowls that are dedicated to and used within the Japanese tea ceremony, Chano Yu, and also the way that you think about the tea bowl in the context of your own artistic vocabulary.
Wow. Making a tea bowl, I mean, we're Americans, making a tea bowl, to be used with tea, or to, just sit and to be looked at, but hopefully it comes alive through use. And tea bowls can carry the kind of the meaning of an entire culture in Japan. I mean, they date back, thousands of years. I was kind of reading an article on tea bowls the other day, and it was interesting kind of comparing it to our own world and society. We're again, stressed with war around the world, and but tea bowls were brought into the Japanese culture during a time of a time of warfare and lots of assassinations and strife, and they were brought in kind of maybe as a quiet moment in people's lives where they could lay down their swords and go into a room and share some tea and conversation with each other without fear of being killed. I enjoy making tea bowls. I like the irregularity of the surface. I always try to think about the inclusion, subtly the inclusion of the basic tenets of geometry, where you have circle, square, and triangle included in just about every piece, and that's carried through in the mark making on the foot, the cutting of the foot, the rim, the decoration process, and these get placed. T-bowl is relatively easy to make, but they're placed in very, very high stress, very high ash areas and fire areas of the kiln, and probably more than half of them don't survive. And so, I'm trying to bring the idea that as somebody holds this in their hand and they hold it in a certain direction, that they can view into the horizon, and that they can also reflect their own sort of interests and personalities into this, or their own quietness. I had a Japanese friend say, the idea of, we hear wabi sabi, but he said, wabi sabi it's a phenomenon, it's not a thing. And so it's an idea that of that quietness. Jan and I live in the country, and we spend a lot of time in the morning, especially in the summertime, having coffee on the porch and just listening to the woods wake up. And I very often think of the kind of the echoes, again, the layering of sounds that the birds and the tree frogs and things make in our woods. And as those build upon each other, I try to bring those ideas into each T-bowl.
So I would like to also posit the notion that you, beside having tea in it, you could have Jameson. And that would certainly center your world again. No, back to the real world. The notion that the tea-bowl within Japanese society over some 4 centuries certainly has been a fundamental object of sharing, of small community, and of attentiveness to the world around each of us. And so each time I see the tea-bowl, or I hold it, and these have the same thumb indentation that you have in your unomis, there's a sense of comfort and at easiness with the object itself. There's an invitation that comes just from the holding of it that makes an extraordinary difference in appreciating what you have achieved in each one of them. And it would seem to me it's also, and Chris, you can talk to this too, even though the form is a repetitive form in your vocabulary, each individual bowl has a personality and a presence, and hence is a new invitation, both for the maker and for the holder.
Yeah, and it's I mean, it connects to the idea. To me, T-bowls are about community on a certain level. You reference the fact that they can be very similar in the making, and then through the firing and through the process, they become individualized in a way that in some ways is predictable, but in many ways it isn't. And isn't that what conversation is about? Isn't that what sitting with somebody and quietly talking, or and you can romanticize all this in some way, but it's very real. And one of the things I love that you put the photograph of the foot in this, because if you're looking at it as a 2-dimension, on the screen, we don't really see what's happening on the other side of that pot, but the foot kind of reveals it. And you have one side that is being blasted by the wood ash, which is there's a certain amount of energy in that is it's kind of like you're in a conversation where the energy is active and you're really going into this thing with somebody else, and then on the other side of the pot it's really quiet. so that kind of to me represents a pause. It's a space in between words. So there's this wonderful kind of give and take of energy, kind of active and passive in this pot. And to me, it just continues the metaphor of what this is you hold it, you drink, it's contemplative, but it's also communal. And I think that's kind of what the power of this piece has and this form has.
I love that. And I think the notion as the world turns, that community becomes both more difficult to sustain and more important to sustain. That it brings us into a space with others where each of us brings our own interest, personality, and spirit. And when those are combined, then there's the possibility of some kind of harmony coming out of that. The world is so bereft of that, that this small, simple object certainly provides an invitation for all people, I think, to think differently about relationships and the communities in which they are living. Let's look at the next piece, Caroline, and if you don't mind, I'd love for you just to talk about that from your perspective.
On this piece, well,
Absolutely.
this one's pretty different. It's pretty unique. I think it has some that raw wood fired vibes to it. I'm actually curious, Randy, where I've never seen this shape before, where it's, if everyone is seeing on screen, it's kind of hard to know. It's fairly large. I mean, 10 by 9. But I'm wondering where you were inspired to bring this form in so tight at the top.
This is actually a new, relatively new form for me. And last winter, I mean, started making bowls and kind of extending, thinking a lot about extending and encapsulating interior space. Something I think a lot about, but trying to do that in a very sculptural way. And these bowls started to just occur to me and both a thrown and hand-built way. And I began this very heavily textured surface and the cutting and the carving and the irregular ridge on it, and kind of the indication on the left side of just a little bit of a pass through in that joint seam. So these are totally hand built. They're built starting with a curved slab on the bottom, and then coiled and extruded kind of slabs on the top, the way you might build and add to a large vase form. They're very sculptural. They're very I don't know. I'm still quite curious about them, and actually quite excited about just all the different surface possibilities on these pieces. And as Chris was talking about the T-bowls and stuff, I was thinking that he and I have shared firing large wood-fired kilns, and each of these pieces, the T-bowls and bowls like this, they're not just accidentally put in the kiln. Their places in the kiln are chosen to try to encourage or enhance specific aspects of the making. And this piece, I think, is real indicative of that. The location and the orientation of that seam is placed towards the fire, but to try to enhance just a bit of a shadow. Rambling on here a bit, but I think a little bit about this piece like a charcoal drawing. Just a very kind of heavy-handed interaction of the surface of the clay, and additive and subtractive kind of aspects of it. And the two little lugs on the right side are very important in terms of how that divides the space, and also doesn't quite show up in this image, but how they direct the eye up into that interior space.
Yeah, I will say this piece of all the ones, it's funny, Mr. Pucker asked me to talk about this one first. I think it's resisted me understanding it the most, and maybe it's the freshness of the piece. it certainly touches on something was thinking of when we were talking about the T-bowl, is that in any object in the round, I think pottery does it the best, and I'd say atmospheric and wood-fired pieces do it even better, is each little section is a conversation. Like if someone owned this piece or that T-bowl, you probably never see the whole thing. It'd be a conversation continually. You'd sit and rotate it constantly, seeing something new. And this one does that too, with instead of treatment necessarily of you know, your wax resistant everything, it's that wood fire with that texture of the clay. Yeah, this one is fresh, kind of like a charcoal drawing. That's interesting. You consider it like that.
There's also an interior aspect to it that doesn't show in this image, but where the wood ash has landed on the inside has a different softness to it that casts some beautiful recording of the fire that's gone through the piece and in and around it.
Chris, your thoughts?
One of the things that I think Randy does in the work that is really interesting is he'll set up a I don't know if you want to call it a system, but you'll set up a certain way you organize a form. Okay. And then you'll do this little thing to screw it up. And I just love that. And that's the little you know, the two little slabs of clay there, that they're in a completely different language than everything else. You know, it's kind of a harder edge. Everything else is kind of soft and muddled, you know, and surfaced. And this has a really sharp line to it. And it's kind of a counterpoint. And you do that a lot in the work. And it's one of the things I really appreciate about the work. You're always adding like a whisper or like a large crack of a sound. You know, there's something happening that is in one type of visual language, or it's in one voice, if you will, and then you kind of punch it with something, and it's the counterpoint to it. And I think of music when I think of that. I think of, again, we were talking about conversation earlier. It's like you're speaking at a certain tonal quality, and all of a sudden somebody lowers their voice or somebody raises it. And I think that's what these little moments that you create do. And I think it's really powerful on this piece.
Well, and this is either.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say this is either the perfect place to bring this up or not, but this piece I think is a good example, because we see two of those marks that Chris was pointing out. They remind me a lot, Randy, of, you have vases that are kind of, I always consider them like torso forms, and they often have like, it looks like a belly button on them because they're very human shaped and evocative of like just like that section of the body, and they kind of look South American to me. But then this one brings in, you have like those two strong lines, but there's other pots that echo those vases, becoming more like bowls, but then they have like this belly button form to them. And that's what I always associate these with. And that might be because, I mean, it's a clay body, and, you know, pots themselves are very much like people, but that's kind of where I see these.
I think there's always aspects of anthropomorphism and architecture, and you know, Christmas and music, and I mean, I think all those things can be brought into pieces in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways. I mean, Chris referred to the piece as very quiet. I don't necessarily see this as a quiet piece. It's very you know, it's very masculine to me, but it has elements of femininity and you know, the coarseness of the fire. One aspect of all art, again, and specifically African art, that I enjoy is that system of contrast, and those little twiggy things, Chris, that you were talking about, where all of a sudden you're moving along a certain direction, and then you're tweaked or thrown off balance by something. And you know, I think those elements are so important and curious in the work, so that they you know, they trigger an emotional, and also they challenge somebody's thinking in a way, maybe as Bernie said earlier, they're challenging the thinking process in a way that hasn't been challenged before. You know, and those marks might seem, I don't think they seem arbitrary, but if you would look at them head on, there's a particular shape, there's a particular amount of space between them. They're not exactly parallel. You know, and I think of Donald Judd's comment once in his sculpture, it's not the two rocks in the Japanese garden, it's the space between the rocks that's important. And I think as we bring those elements to bear on in our work, that becomes the conversation.
I would just add a couple of thoughts, one of which is we have these large platters or ozara, large dishes from Onda that are sometimes 27 inches in diameter. And they have a beautiful chatter pattern on Matobigana, Hakame, this kind of brushwork. And it's all perfectly orderly. And then, for whatever reasons, the maker decided to do a squiggle line all the way around the entire pot. And Brother Thomas one time looked at it and turned to me and said, "That was such a beautiful pot. And look, they just messed it up with that squiggle mark, and it's 10 times better." And what he was really saying was, how do you get people to engage with what is there and then go beyond that? And this little rectangular piece here certainly enhances my ability to enjoy the surface textures, the dark opening as it's photographed, the shape. What it's a lesson in for me, and I hope for everyone else, is a lesson in looking. And to realize that not only Randy, but so many of the artists that we work with invest so much in the creation of the piece that is conscious, plus what is unconscious. And it is for us, the viewer or the participant, to really engage with, in a very serious manner, that which has been put into the piece already. It's a wonderful poem, and at the same time, we bring our own experience to it, but the poem already alerts us to those factors, ideas, experiences that are waiting for us. So if we can look at the next piece, it would be great.
Yes, sorry. There we go.
Wonderful. So Chris, do you want to talk a bit about this one? And then we'll go to Randy, because it's quite a wonderful piece in a very related, but nonetheless different manner.
This one's great. And I've watched Randy make these and on different scales. And first of all, there's, you know, we haven't really talked about it, but there's a way that Randy moves clay that goes back to the title of the show, the sense of memory, you know, and maker of memory. And when you work on this one's what, 13 inches wide, is that right?
Yep.
And so it's a little over a foot. You know, I've seen these. I think we're going to look at another one that's much larger, but there's a sense of process in these that is actually quite difficult to do, and yet it's done in such a way that it's so simple, it's so natural. The marking on it, you know, I talked on that first piece. The Nuka glaze does this to me. It brings up this idea for me of memory, of snow, of water, of froth, of kind of a you know, a liquid, or a liquid moving into a solid, moving across something. And you know, I know that Randy skis a lot, and I have no idea if any of this is in his thinking. But a piece like this, you know, it's like trails of the skis moving through the surface of snow on a mountain, on the side of a hill. It's fields, you know, that are being mowed and plowed, and some part of the center is hasn't been touched yet. The corners have. There's so many doors into analogy here. that to me keep this piece quite alive, because I think every time you look at it, you kind of bring another sense of your own history to it. And then just lastly, volume. Randy talks about kind of interior space in his work, about how that feeds his ideas. The contour of this piece is really beautiful. It's a circle. It's a plane that kind of moves like that, but because he triangulates it, the energy on the corners is really different than the energy on the sides of that, how that slope works. And I feel it from my body, not necessarily intellectually. And I think that's really a powerful thing when a maker can do that, where experience is felt through the gut rather than necessarily through the mind. So I just wanted to talk about how dramatic that volume is and how quiet it is, but it has a tremendous amount of energy in it.
Well, this actually, what Chris has said actually goes into a question that one of our viewers has from Kristen. It's for Randy. It says, I know, and this was submitted for the previous piece. She says, I know that the architecture plays an important role in your work, and this piece heavily speaks of a house or hut, doors and walls. Pottery can say many things, but this work very much shows your breadth of architectural design and works well to say so much to me. Do you find any parts of your passions preceded others as you build, or does it just show itself as you go?
Can you repeat that last part of that question?
Yeah. Do you find any parts of your passions superseded others as you build, or does it just show itself as you go? So is there a certain passion maybe that's first and foremost over others, or yeah, does it just kind of come up subconscious?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I work in the studio. I'm privileged to just follow my passion. And I thank Chris for all those, incredible comments about this piece. But I am thinking about architecture all the time, and not just the formal aspects of the building, but kind of what makes structure. And Chris and I have had lots of conversations about geometry and Fibonacci's numbers and things like that. And we think about line and volume and the growth of that. And so when I'm in the studio working, I'm always, I don't know if it's always on a conscious level, but unconsciously now I'm in a position where I've made work for 50 some years, and I can bring to play those experiences, if that's a good way to put it. My experiences of architecture, my experiences of volume. One of my favorite pieces that some of these pieces are sourcing or springing off of is I have this beautiful broken piece of basalt. And when basalt comes out of the ground, it cools in these massive kind of hexagonal crystals or needles. And when those needles break, they break with a particular curvature in the cup. And I don't know, what determines that, the crystal structure or the basalt or whatever, I don't really care. But I have a chunk of that, it fills with water, it drains out one side, it has kind of a deckled or fractured edge like this. And I walk by that daily on the way to the studio, and that is constantly like a source of architecture, influence, volume, things I look at it, and I not that I'm trying to copy it, but I'm trying to take that information and how Chris described it as a visceral reaction, how to viscerally kind of include that in the making of my work. So I hope that answers the question. So.
I would just add this quote that I've had in front of me for the last 3 images of Thomas's, that the only authentic path we must follow is the one we find within. And exactly what you just said, Randy, is, your external, the basalt piece that's near you that you see on a daily basis, these become integrated into who you are. And then the pieces that you have created, and I hope that everyone who's listening or looking will understand this, are expressions of who you are in the very most essential way. And that's what art can be about. So the joy of having both this conversation, but also the realization that what you as a maker and as an artist continue to do is to continue to share that which is within you, that you can certainly teach everybody the surface technical abilities, but it is their obligation as an artist to dig within themselves to share which is uniquely theirs. And the joy of the gallery for me, for us over all these years, has been the opportunity to really share with others the spirit of so many creative individuals that it just elevates every day that certainly I come into the space and I'm surrounded by wonderful objects, this just being one of them. Can we look at the next one? Go ahead, sorry.
I think what you said is so true, Bernie. And, you know, and Chris and I have both been teachers, and it's, you know, so rewarding to try to encourage people to find their own voice and to believe in themselves and in themselves, and to bring that spirit into their making process.
This is a really joyous piece for me, because what we did was, and if you can look at the next one, then we'll come back to this. This is one of his teachers, Shimaoka's Kakuchi, a sake pour, if you will. And then now go back to Randy's, and let's look at that. And Randy, how did you get here?
It's really interesting. I mean, I like the word Kakuchi is means basically one-sided mouth in Japanese, and they're taking the kana is a one-sided blade or sword, and so by putting a spout on one side of a piece, and Shimoka's case, it's probably more functional than this, but in this case, it's taking that idea, retaining the idea of an opening or a mouth on one side, but transforming it for me into a very sculptural object. And again, the shape of the basalt comes into mind here. This is a double wall piece, so it's a hollow form. And as you put it together, the clay, and anybody that's worked in clay, I know, has probably had this experience. Clay has this incredible sensuality. And as you drape it over this open space, it traps air inside. And I can actually put a little pinhole in the surface and let the air out slowly, and it takes on this suspension, like a cloth suspended by the parameters, the contours of the exterior form, and it creates this beautiful kind of bowl-like form. This piece for me goes into the ideas of ritual and possibly spiritual kind of things, religion. I don't foresee pouring sake or eating anything out of it, but it just becomes an idea placed, you know, on a table or on a, you know, some kind of display format of the idea of pouring and what that means for us as human beings. You know, what would we pour? Kind of a curiosity out of this.
Chris, your thoughts?
Well, you know, I loved how you talked, Randy, how you talked about, you know, you saw this piece as sculptural. Okay. And, you know, it's interesting because I kind of see a lot of your work in that way. But what I'm loving about this work is the kind of the blockiness of it. You know, it is like, it has a mass to it that we were talking about in that kind of more platter, kind of open bowl form. I was talking about the contour of that space. This is really different. it has a visual weight to it because of that wall that just, again, it enhances that center. You know, we're talking about that drape. It enhances that in a way where if that was just a simple edge that followed that contour on the external, you know, it'd be a very different form. But having that vertical in there just drops that volume in there, and it's this. There's two languages just playing in there. It's almost volcanic, you know. I don't know if I spent at one point in my life, I was out in the Azores, and I was walking the interior of volcanoes, you know, and and to me, it has that sense of earth and monumentality, and you have this interior space that's formed in a completely different way than the exterior, and it's really beautiful. It's massive, but it's also, you know, as with most of your work, I see them as very quiet contemplative pieces, and this one certainly embodies that.
Well, and it's
When we look
interesting
at-
you bring it up oh, sorry, Mr. Becker, should we move on?
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Oh, I think it's interesting that Randy brought it up in the context of religion, because I think this piece, which has been the second to resist me the most in all the forms, it is sculptural and it's removed a little bit from function, but more than anything, I do want to pour water in it and pour it out. And I think that in a way sculpturally elevates what's most important about pottery, and that potters, especially nowadays, they are artists, but they are putting that onto a form that is defined by its negative space more so than really anything else. The fact that the negative space in the entire pot is what makes it important. It's not a yonomi if you can't drink out of it. It's not a tea bowl if you can't put something, a platter. And this piece kind of is in between that sculptural and function, and it literally elevates, you know, by having that double wall, it elevates that note, that idea of the beauty of ceramics and the beauty of clay, of that pouring out of the water and reminding us of spirit, which is, I think, what ceramics does, period.
It's beautifully said. It reminds me of a show we did many years ago called Yonobi in Japanese, which means the beauty of use. And if we look at the next slide of Shimaoka's piece, this is clearly a pour, and you get a long pour with this one, Randy, rather than a short pour in yours. But it also has, and we have in the gallery collection also two Kakuchis by Shoji Hamada, all very different in terms of the surface design, but very similar in the form itself, so that you have sort of known that those exist, and at the same time in your own vocabulary created a form that is inspired by those, but at the same time very much your own. And certainly the next piece we'll look at does that in wonderful ways, and it's a form that I think has been part of your exhibition since we began back in 2008. So it's really a joy to see the form present, changing very subtly, and at the same time the surfaces of them becoming ever more interesting. So Randy, you talk a bit about it.
Well, this has the glaze I think so many potters embrace and love, the Shino glaze. You know, it's foments and the irascibility of it, and pinholing, and you know, there's a lot of risk, and I think that's another thing Chris and I share in common when we put our pieces into these big wood kilns, is there's a certain amount of risk involved in the placement and how the fire is going to react to the form in the piece. Bernie, as you notice, these pieces have evolved over my making process. I was looking back at some of the earlier ones, much blockier, much more square. And these newer pieces are darted top and bottom. I control the length of the darts to kind of control the volume and the curvature. Then they has a wonderful black slip and wax resist, and crackly Shino glaze and wood ash and the firing. So, you know, one can always hope that the fire reacts to the piece and the form and wraps around it. And I like that last piece we're looking at too. I love what the fire did to this piece, how it just kind of makes the piece glow. You know, the piece has recorded that fire for forever for thousands of years.
It is like fireworks on the 4th of July, looking out our window toward the Charles River, for sure. It has that glow of energy, and after the fireworks have opened, and then they progressively come down on those very beautiful shoulders of this particular piece. And at the same time, the lobes create almost 4 or 6 or 8 different visions of those fireworks, Randy. It's really, really quite extraordinary. We're going to move on only because, as ever, I chose more pieces than we'll ever be able to talk about within the designated time, and we'll probably exceed it. But we need to talk about this one. And Chris, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, just to begin.
Okay, well, this one, Randy and I, we talk a lot about, when we're talking about pots, we talk a lot about the the nature of making, if you will, and ideas around different forms we're working on. The boat form, Randy's been doing for quite a while, but there's so much invention in such a simple shape, and over the years, Randy has kind of tackled that question of how do you replicate a form, or how do you use an idea over time where you're always bringing something new to it, so you're not repeating yourself, you're always asking a new question. And this one, just the way the black is used against the passive, how that orange wadding mark just is an explosion in the center of this. It's just a different language, and it reflects the foot in color, but it also, it's like you have a rectangular line, and then you have a circle on top of that. It is energetic in all the ways you want a pot to be, and left is not the same as right. There's different information on all parts of it. And it just keeps your eye really in the piece for something that is, again, so simple in its geometry and its shape. And I think that's the beauty of how Randy's approached these boat forms over the years, is he's always attacking it in a different way of organizing that really simple space. And he does it through color. He does it through kind of an organization of, like, something's a little more passive on this side, a little heavier on that side. And these are all formal issues, but in the end, when you look at the piece, the formal stuff kind of falls away, and all you're seeing is activity and energy. So,
Nicely said, Randy.
Well, thanks, Chris. I mean, Chris and I also have shared sailing experiences together on the high seas, and the boat go back to when I was a little boy, and I had a little wood boat. I tried to keep it from sinking most of the time, and hauled it out in the winter, turned it over, and so the idea of a hull or the boat is kind of embedded into my psyche, I think. I've always been interested also historically in the Egyptian votive boats. Not only the representatives that they used on the Nile to transport and run their culture for 2,600 years, but they made little lead ones that were used in some kind of ceremonies. And I'm not, a religious person so much as a spiritual person, I think, but I like the idea sometimes of not actually knowing what they use these curious objects for, but the objects have a presence, they have an identity, they still collaborate and communicate with me over time. And again, I just try to bring all those things to bear and be playful as I make these. I love the cantilever, and clay is soft at cone 10 again. Chris knows that as much as any of us. And I have to support the ends as they get cantilevered out into space. And that's always a challenge too, to bring these through any 4 or 5 day firing.
can I say one other thing here?
Sure.
One of the things I love about these forms is that they're very functional, and yet you're not telling them how to use it. You're not telling anybody how to use it or what to put in it. And there's something in that is really beautiful to me, that even a very specific object that could be used, the use is non-specific, which opens the door to kind of the possibility of invention of the user, what they bring to it. And this piece, this type of form really exemplifies that for you.
And the next one will as well. Caroline, there you go. That's what, 22 inches across. So this is an even greater challenge to figure out how to use it, among other things. And we have another photograph of it because we wanted that sense of the power and the strength of the piece. It's very, very much like a shield when it's up like this. When it was before as a bowl form, it's an invitation for a variety of uses. But Randy, this is a form that I think appeared in the last show at this scale, and now reappears with an even richer copper glazed surface with some color in it that's beautiful.
Well, thank you, Bernie. It's a big monumental piece. I love the copper surface. It reminds me of bronze, and that's the intention of that. And again, playing with some very simple things where you have a surface tension, you have a volume to play with, you have a split edge, and you're just trying to like cast that volume into space by bringing all those elements together. And I think it works on this piece.
And Chris?
Well, again, I'm going to go back to kind of one of the things we talked about in the earlier piece is just these little, very quiet details Randy throws in to give a point of reference for your eye, and it's in the corners of this kind of triad, if you will, this triangular edge, and you have it on the interior, but you also have it on the exterior, but they're done differently. And that's a beautiful, I think that's a really beautiful, quiet moment that breaks up, gives again a little focal point that just breaks up that interior space in a way, just as it's about to go over the edge. And it's not in the middle, it's not on the side, it's just as you're going over that edge. And it kind of highlights the power of that edge visually.
And something quiet, I just want to point out, it still is saying something, right? It makes me think a whisper is sometimes more powerful than a shout. And I think a piece that's quiet like this, even though it's quite large and the boat form shows quite a nice range that Randy has.
Yeah, and when I say quiet, believe me, I'm not saying boring.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I know.
It's just there's so much ceramic work that's loud.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's why I like to point out that quiet can be so good.
And this is just a very different sense of space. And we talk about time. This is a very different way of spending time with an object. You don't get it quick. You have to be willing to kind of be with it. And that's asking something, to listen. And that's a different thing than a piece that is kind of shouting at you,
Well, the marks that you are talking about, Chris, I studied American Indian membranous pots and also Northwest Coast pieces. And one of the very curious things with those pieces is the pass-through holes that pretty much allow the human spirit to pass from an interior to exterior space, and so that openness, I think, or that sense of a perforation or sense of a doorway allows that, and it also directs your eye to that point, and thinking. As when I taught drawing, where you can make a partial line and then you can put a mark on the other piece of the paper, and the viewer would join those two marks. You don't have to have a continuous line from point A to point Z. And it's a very playful thing. It's very subtle. There's actually quite a bit of time and thought put into those. So yeah, I love this piece.
There's an issue that, Chris, that you raised too about the notion of quiet or quietude that is active rather than passive, that these works really do invite. But again, it's always the same, and that's one of the purposes, I think, of these conversations, is to provide people with both the vocabulary and the direction as to how to experience and how to engage with the work. Thomas wrote some time ago, only those who risk going too far can possibly learn how far one can go. And I would say that's a wonderful description of this body of work, Randy, that it keeps moving you, moving us, moving the viewer into new opportunities to both experience and enjoy and expand the world in which we live. So there's a constant sense of openness, of learning on your end, and at the same time, your willingness to create forms and surfaces and textures that are an invitation to each one of us to grow, to learn, and to somehow be uplifted as you lift up the pot. I just want to thank both Randy and Chris and Caroline so much for all that you've shared with these pieces. We could have gone on, and we almost did, but I decided that this piece needs to be kind of the crescendo of the moment to summarize our time together. And Randy, as you said at the very beginning, I just want to share this quote with you. It is right to be acknowledged and gracious to acknowledge. No one does anything alone. And I think the opportunity to work together with you, to have known you, to have had the privilege of showing your work and sharing it has been something that's nourished both of us. So I just want to thank you so much for that and for the creation of the works as you have done.
Thank you, Bernie, so much for that. And
Looking forward to seeing you.
We'll see you coming up on this weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, so much, and Caroline.
It was great fun.
Thank you.